This reading is more microeconomic analysis, and it covers the firm and different market structures. One of the best readings in microeconomics, in my humble opinion. And let's get straight into it, because we start off with a great slide which pretty much summarizes the different market structures that we are going to look at. So you can break this reading down very simply into 4 different sections, starting with perfect competition on the left and going all the way through to a monopoly. Perfect competition, as the name suggests, the most competitive environment, through to a monopoly, which is the least competitive, obviously. In the middle, be a little bit careful. Just remember, monopolistic competition, despite its name, is pretty close to perfect competition and not that close to a monopoly. So if we very quickly just make sure we look at the characteristics, we will cover them again, but this acts as a kind of nice high-level view. Starting with perfect competition, lots and lots and lots and lots of firms in the industry. So what that means, as we'll see, is that each individual firm has no real power over the rest of the industry. Barriers to entry, very low, non-existent. And whenever you see that, that pretty much means you're not going to be able to sustain long-run profits. Remember, we're talking economic profits, so we're saying no long-run excess returns. In the long run, profits will tend to be zero, as there are also no barriers to exit. Lots of good substitutes. In fact, as we'll see, they are homogeneous products, so everybody produces the exact same product. And the nature of competition is price only. The market will dictate the price. The individual firm will then sell whatever it likes at that price. It has no pricing power. We'll call it a price taker, as we'll see. Monopolistic. Still lots and lots of firms with low barriers to entry. And this is the key. There are good substitutes around, but you do have a degree of differentiation in the product. In perfect competition, homogeneous products, all identical, but monopolistic, there's slight differentiation. And that leads to competition. The differentiation means firms will compete on the type or the innovation, the different twists in their individual products to try and get some brand loyalty. Gives them some pricing power, which means they will have a downward sloping demand curve and an even steeper marginal revenue. That's as opposed to the individual firm in perfect competition, where we'll see a horizontal demand curve equal to marginal revenue. Keeping going to the right, you'll see an oligopoly, few firms with high barriers to entry. Now we're seeing barriers to entry. We'll start to see economic profits that are potentially sustainable. Might be good substitutes, might be differentiated. It doesn't really matter for an oligopoly. They will compete on price. So again, we're going to see a downward sloping demand curve and some pricing power, significant pricing power. It depends on the model we look at. The oligopoly is the one where we have several rather different types of model to talk about. And a monopoly, probably the term you're most familiar with. Single firm, very high barriers to entry, hence the monopoly situation. No good substitutes. You are the sole seller of that product. Advertising really is what they use to try and sell more of their product, and they choose the price. It's up to them. They are the sole seller. So that sets the scene quite nicely. Let's get into each one in turn, starting with perfect competition. In a perfectly competitive market, each individual firm is a price taker. That should become an alarm bell for you in the exam. If any question mentions price takers, you know immediately you are talking about a firm in perfect competition. The idea is they take the equilibrium, the market price, as a given from the market and sell as much as they like at that given price. Characteristics, they sell a homogeneous product. So everyone's product, as I say, is identical. So if you imagine you're going to the gym, it's my classic example, you want a white t-shirt. In a world of perfect competition, every single seller would sell the exact same plain white cotton t-shirt. And you would not care who you bought it from. Large number of firms, as we say, they're small to the relative market. They have no power over the market. They can't affect the market. That means, just to stress it, just for the firm, you have a perfectly elastic demand curve, which, as I mentioned, just want to get this stuck in your head, means the demand curve is equal to marginal revenue. No barriers to entry or exit means in the long run we will see zero economic profits. And it's supply and demand that determine the market price. So the overall market will have classic supply and demand curves, upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. That will dictate the price at which the individual firm can sell as much as they like. They are the characteristics. Let's have a look at a diagram to see how we decide where to produce. In perfect competition, again, note this is for the individual firm. So the market has dictated P, the market price. We therefore, as a firm, can sell as much as we like at that price and have a perfectly horizontal demand curve, which is also the marginal revenue curve. We then decide where to produce by matching MC and MR. If we want to maximize profits, we will always set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So we'll produce where MC equals MR. There it is. So MC equals MR. Just so happens in this perfectly competitive situation, because the demand curve is horizontal and equal to marginal revenue, we're also setting MC equal to the price. And just for fun, remember the price is also the marginal benefit. So actually, under perfect competition, when the firm sets MC to MR to maximize profit, it also is setting MC equal to MB, marginal cost equal to marginal benefit, which means it's an efficient equilibrium. That's what we'll produce, P, and hence the equilibrium quantity Q. To work out our economic profit, revenue less costs, we'll compare the price we're selling for P to the average total cost. So if we put in an average total cost curve, let's imagine it's that blue line. Remember, marginal cost will cut the average total cost curve at its minimum. In this case, there's the price we're selling for. Here is the average total cost. Now in this situation, because the price is greater than the average total cost, we have an economic profit on every unit. And that number of units, so that grey box, is our economic profit. Total revenue less the costs of production. Now, key point. That is a possibility in the short run. Yes, under perfect competition, a firm could make short-run economic profits, but in the long run, those profits will be wiped out. There are no barriers to entry, no barriers to exit. They will not be sustainable. So, in the long run, what will happen, as mentioned, is we'll end up here, where the average total cost is equal to price. If average total cost lay up here somewhere, and you were looking at that, then you'd add economic losses. Again, they are possible in the short run, but there are no barriers to exit, so in the long run, once again, firms will leave and you'll end up back at zero economic profit. And we'll see the mechanics for that very shortly. But to take away from this diagram, key point, produce where MC equals MR, also happens to be MB, so it's efficient. Read off the average total cost. Exam question could be, in this case, ATC is below the price, economic profits sustainable in the short run. What about the long run equilibrium? Well, it will look like this for the firm. In the long run, zero economic profits. Just a quick note how we get to this equilibrium price, P star there. On the left-hand side is the entire market. So note, and this could be a little tricky question on the day, for the entire market, we have a standard downward sloping demand curve. So D there on the left is the market demand curve, upward sloping supply. Where those two cross is your equilibrium. That gives us the price, which, remember the term, the individual firm takes. So you just take P star and then sell as much as you like at that given market price. Hence, the perfectly horizontal demand curve which is also the marginal revenue curve. It's also average revenue, which is just another definition of price. In the long run, you choose MC to be equal to MR, which is here. Because there are no barriers to entry or exit, as I've mentioned, in the long run, you will produce where price is equal to average total cost. Zero economic profits. Also happens to be, and this must be the case, the minimum point on the average total cost curve. ATC is equal to price and marginal cost is also equal to price. We know marginal cost cuts the ATC curve at its minimum. So that's a long-run equilibrium, which you will see. Now then, what about the firm and the industry supply curves? On the left this time, we have the firm, and on the right, we have the market supply curve. We are asked in this reading to be able to identify how to come up with the supply curve for the market under perfect competition. It's something we can't really do for any other market structure. We'll not be able to put together very simply a market supply curve for monopolists, for oligopolists, or for a monopoly, or monopolistic competition, I should say. But we can do it here for our perfectly competitive market. On the left, you see the firm. There's its marginal cost curve. Here are its average cost curves. And all we do is decide what the firm should do in the short and long run. Well, let's imagine the price they've taken from the market is P1. At P1, you can see we are just about covering average variable cost, which means we should keep going in the short run, but we're not covering total cost, therefore we should shut down in the long run. So firms, as long as they can get P1, will supply in the short run. Anywhere between P1 and P2, well, we're covering variable but not total. Again, we'll keep going in the short run. Anywhere above P2, we're covering total costs, and the firm should also keep going in the long run. So a quick recap. Less than P1, not covering variable costs, we will shut down. Therefore, nobody is supplying at a price below P1. As long as we're covering P1, as long as we're covering AVC, so above P1, then firms will supply in the short run. And all we do to get the market supply curve is add together all the individual firm supply curves. Anywhere above P2, all costs are covered. We break even at P2 and make economic profits above P2. So quite simply from that slide, take away this. Anywhere below P1, there is no supply in the short run. Above P1, add together the individual firm supply curves, and you'll get the short run market supply curve. And we're done. Okay, let's see then what happens if we start to shift demand in a perfectly competitive market. Once again, and this is the case throughout perfect competition, it's always important to identify whether we're talking short run or long run. So this slide is the short run increase in demand. On the left is that standard supply and demand curve. Downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. Initially, that gives us an equilibrium of P1, which the individual firm takes, their price taker. They take P1 and then choose to reduce where the marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Remember, demand curve is marginal revenue. Here's marginal cost, and we produce there. All standard. What happens if there's an increase in demand? Well, use this to revise microeconomics. Increase in demand, the demand curve is going to shift to the right. That shift to the right in the market gives us a higher equilibrium price. We'll now produce at P2. What does that mean for the individual firm? Well, if we were in equilibrium to start with, down here, that zero profits, let's say, an increase in the price is going to give economic profits to the firm. However, that we know is only sustainable in the short run because in the long run, firms will enter and wipe those profits out. But certainly in the short run at least, an increase in demand can lead to short-run profits. In the long run, new firms will enter and wipe those profits out. If we'd gone in the other direction, so you can imagine if we did a decrease in demand, demand shifts back to the left, we make losses, firms exit, and again, bring your economic profits back to zero. So let's have a look at that in action. Short run, fine, but what about a permanent increase? Once again on the left is our industry, the entire market. Downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. P0 is our equilibrium price. If we're in equilibrium as a firm, we'll produce there where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The minimum point, where ATC equals price, zero economic profit. What happens? Demand increases. P0 goes up to P1, and the firm initially rejoices. Now we are producing above average total cost. We have that grey area, which we are now familiar with, is our profit. But there are no barriers to entry, so as we can see, new firms enter. Well, if new firms enter, that will affect the industry. More firms means more supply. An increase in supply means the supply curve will shift to the right, bringing the price back down to P0 and wiping those economic profits out. Hence, you can see again in the short term, profits in the short term, but not on a permanent basis. That pretty much does it for perfect competition. All we're going to do is just look at a couple of extra examples of different market structures, but PC is done. Key point to take away, zero long-run profits. What about monopolistic? Slightly different market structure. Under monopolistic competition, still large number of firms, still each firm has a small market share, no collusion, all of that pretty similar to perfectly competitive markets, but this is the big difference. Products are now differentiated. Under perfect competition, my example was white t-shirts, plain cotton white t-shirts, no difference, homogeneous. Now, these t-shirts are close but not perfect substitutes, slightly more realistic. So you're going to the gym, you want a white t-shirt, could be Nike, could be Adidas, could be Under Armour, and so on. You've got all these slightly different products, some of them that are stretchy, some breathe on your behalf, etc. You face a downward sloping demand curve. Key point, if it's downward sloping, marginal revenue is also downward sloping but steeper. But it is relatively elastic, which means fairly gentle slope. Still, if you change your price, big impact on quantity. Firms compete on price, quality, and marketing. So in my example, this is why you see millions of dollars spent on advertising, millions of dollars paid to athletes to wear a particular brand. Low barriers to entry, that should give you the answer straight away to the simple question, can you sustain long-run economic profits? With low barriers to entry, same exact mechanism, firms will enter. That's the problem. So key point here, very similar to perfect, except there are slightly differentiated products, which means downward sloping demand as they compete on price, quality, and marketing. This is what it'll look like. On the left-hand side, a short-run decision. Here is our marginal cost curve. So upward sloping, which we've seen many times before. Here's our demand curve and marginal revenue. Downward sloping demand means a separate downward sloping marginal revenue curve. Still, in every single one of these structures, except one situation we'll talk of later, the individual firm is going to try and maximize profits by setting MC equal to MR. Here's marginal cost. Here's your marginal revenue curve. There is your decision to maximize profits. So the firm will produce at Q. At that point, here, if you read up to your demand curve, is your price. We can see in blue the average total cost curve. There's your cost. Hence, we are making profits. price is greater than average total cost. However, that is in the short run. In the long run, there are no barriers to entry, therefore firms will join, force this equilibrium price down until you produce at a point where ATC is equal to price. Still, MR is equal to MC. We're always going to produce at that profit maximizing output, but you'll find in the long run, we'll end up at a price for that MC equals MR point where it's equal to ATC. Always happens when we have no barriers or very low barriers to entry, that firms will join in, force the price down, and wipe out those long-run economic profits. So firms enter, price falls, it's all wiped out. Now then, is monopolistic competition an efficient outcome? If we jump back to perfect competition, remember under a perfectly competitive market, you'll set MC equal to MR. That's to maximize profits. But as a happy coincidence, when you set MC equal to MR, because the marginal revenue curve is also the demand curve, which is marginal benefit, under a perfectly competitive solution, marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit, and it's efficient. Not the case under monopolistic competition. Under monopolistic competition, you set MC equal to MR, but look, the demand curve is marginal benefit. We're producing here MC equals MR, not where MC equals MB. So from that point of view, it's not an efficient allocation resource, not an efficient allocation of resources. But there are upsides. Although it doesn't seem to be efficient, there is social cost of not producing where P equals MC. Remember, the price is the demand curve, is marginal benefit. So that doesn't happen, as we said. And long-run average cost is not minimized. Remember, under perfect competition it was. And excessive advertising may take place. So firms start to compete against each other and spend millions of dollars on advertising. And fewer producers might be more efficient. This is just a white t-shirt after all. You just need a white t-shirt to go to the gym. Why do you need 15 different people producing the same product with different logos? All of that suggests, look, this is not efficient, but the increased product diversity has positive value to consumers. The fact that you can choose between Adidas and Nike and Under Armour and so on is a benefit to consumers. It's whether that offsets the fact that we're not producing where marginal cost equals marginal benefit. So, more on this efficiency. The good news, this diversity is good because we get brand names, and brand names give you signals about quality. We now know that we trust Nike or Adidas or whoever. We've bought them before and we know their product. Because they are differentiating and competing, using that differentiation, you end up with product innovation. So Under Armour comes in and provides t-shirts that breathe on your behalf and dry quicker and so on and so forth. And although we criticize advertising and the millions of dollars that have been spent, it does give you valuable information. So as a consumer, you know exactly what these t-shirts are doing for you and why they're better for you. Plus, advertising sometimes actually works, believe it or not. So yes, massive advertising cost gives you a huge boost to fixed and hence total cost. But if that advertising spend has a huge impact on sales, actually average total cost might drop. Because although you've increased fixed costs, you increase sales by enough, average fixed costs actually fall. So if you look at a phenomenal advertising campaign, use of celebrity endorsement, look at Nike Jordan, for example, then actually the boost in sales way offsets the increase in costs from advertising. So the answer is unclear. There's no definitive economic answer. It's not an efficient allocation because MC does not equal MB. But as a consumer, you get the benefits of advertising, product innovation, and so on. But at the end of the day, we do need to compare the two and say, look, perfect competition versus monopolistic. On the right, you should be able to recognize perfect competition. Why? Because it has the horizontal, perfectly elastic demand curve, which therefore is also equal to marginal revenue. Remember, demand is also marginal benefit. We choose to produce at Q where MC equals MR, and beautifully that also equals MB. On the left is monopolistic competition, which you should recognize as not being perfect because we have a downward sloping demand curve and hence downward sloping marginal revenue. Choose to produce, as we said, where MC equals MR. There's the cost, there's the price, at least that's in the short run. I can tell that's the short run because we're making economic profits. Now to compare and contrast the two, on the left, we've got excess capacity. The quantity is below the efficient quantity. Why? We are not at the minimum average total cost. And secondly, the price we're charging is higher because it's been marked up above ATC. Neither of those occur in a perfectly competitive market. If you're in perfect competition, price is equal to ATC, not greater than, and you are producing at the minimum average total cost. So it's in diagram form, putting into a kind of diagram what we talked about on the previous slide. Oligopoly next. Oligopoly, small number of sellers. So we're really changing things up now. Perfect and monopolistic, large numbers. Now small number of sellers. Downward sloping demand, which you know immediately means separate and downward sloping marginal revenue. Less elastic than monopolistic. So the demand curves and hence marginal revenue curves are getting steeper. And there is interdependence amongst competitors. So what one does affects the other and hence affects their demand curves. And finally, there are significant barriers to entry, which means profits will be sustainable. Classic barrier to entry, the scale of the operation. If you're huge already, it's very difficult for a small firm to come in and challenge you. They're the key characteristics. In terms of the product, it doesn't really matter. You can have an oligopoly with similar or differentiated products. So make sure you can identify those characteristics. In terms of how an oligopoly works, well, this is kind of unique in this reading in that we don't know. We have a very definitive model for perfect competition, very definitive answer for monopolistic and monopolies. Oligopoly, not quite sure. So we're going to look at a few different possible explanations of their behavior. The first one, the kinked demand model. First thing I'll say before we go anywhere is that it's incomplete. Every single model we've looked at so far, it's all been about starting off by determining the equilibrium price and quantity. The kinked demand model does not tell us anything about how we get to that price and quantity. So it just plucks from midair PK, just says, look, here is the market price. How did you come up with that market price? Kinked demand model will ask, and it will say, I've no idea. We're just assuming it's there. The point of this model is to tell you what happens if we move away from that point. So let's follow through the bullet points. Top one says, let's imagine we start off at PK. There's an oligopoly, let's say two firms sit down across a table and collude and come up with an agreement. Let's say that's how we came up with PK. And then they both move away from the table and go about their business. And one of the firms comes up with the genius idea of cheating and saying, right, that other firm is now going to stick to this agreement and charge PK. I'm going to increase my price. And I'll charge more and hopefully make more money. The downside, your competitor is charging less than you. They will not follow you up. They'll stick to the lower price, undercut you, and you will lose a huge market share. You will find as you increase your price, that change in price leads to a big drop in your market share. People switch to your competitor. That means you have, let's think about this in terms of elasticity, that means you will have small change in price, big change in quantity. You will have elastic demand. However, having tried that and realized it didn't work, if you go in the other direction and try and undercut your competitor, they will follow you down. So you decide to start cutting your prices because everybody follows you, or in my example, your single competitor follows you. You actually don't pick up much market share. So suddenly your demand curve looks inelastic. What that means is it has a kink around the current price. As you raise prices, you'll see a very elastic curve. If you drop them, it looks inelastic. So you have to be able to explain why the demand curve is kinked. That's what these 2 points do. The downside, around the kink, you have a discontinuous marginal revenue curve. So it has a gap in it, which means there's a huge range. There's your curves, marginal revenue curves. Huge range of prices which might work anywhere around about here. So you could have another marginal cost curve in there which would also potentially give you a solution. So it's incomplete. Really what you need for the exam is to tell the examiner about this inelastic versus elastic demand curve. That's one model, the kinked demand model. Second is to look at game theory and come up with a Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium says the choices of all firms are such that no other choice makes any firm better off, i.e. increases or decreases their losses. It's a strategic game. How do you get to the Nash equilibrium? Well, you assume every firm makes the best choice depending on taking into account the actions and reactions of your competitors. You may know and love this if you've ever studied econ before, as the prisoner's dilemma. And then we get the Cournot model. Cournot model can be extended, but the classic is the duopoly. Duopoly model says you've got two firms. Obviously, extending it means you build in more. Assumptions in this model, it's fairly strict, fairly tight. We have a homogeneous product. The firms have market power, so what they supply to the market will affect price. Fairly standard for an oligopoly. Firms choose their quantities simultaneously, and perhaps the most restrictive here, both firms have identical and constant marginal costs of production. In that situation, what you will find is that both will end up producing at the Nash equilibrium. The market price will be lower than it would be under a monopoly situation, but still higher than perfect competition. And if you extend it and add in more and more and more firms, then the market price will actually head towards marginal cost. So that's one example of how we can get to a Nash equilibrium using what's known as the Cournot model. Okay, we've talked a little bit about here, kink demand, Nash equilibrium, Cournot. And I've mentioned collusion and sitting down across the table. Let's actually look at how that might work, because for the entire oligopoly versus the firm, there's an interesting and unique conclusion here that we could draw. If the firms in the oligopoly actually collude, we are going to start off here on the right-hand side. And when colluding, we will start off by setting the marginal cost of the oligopoly, the actual industry, equal to the marginal revenue of the industry. So there's the marginal revenue, there's the marginal cost. We sit around a table and we decide that's where we should produce. So QM is the quantity we'll produce for the entire market. At, well, we read up to the industry, the entire oligopoly's demand curve, and set the price to be P0. Each firm then agrees, we kind of derive back to the left here, each firm agrees, okay, that's the price. We'll split the quantity, so QM is the total amount. We'll split the quantity and each produce half of that QM. We'll charge P0, and if we successfully collude, hopefully it ends up as a profit. Otherwise, it was a terrible agreement to come to. So we read off and say at QM over 2, half the industry supply. We've taken P0. Remember, we got there by setting the industry marginal cost to marginal revenue. Set at P0. Here is our average total cost curve there. That's the price we're selling at. Over QM over 2, that's our economic profit. Is it sustainable? Well, yes, because we have barriers to entry and we've colluded. It's important to collude. If this collusion is not successful, we will simply compete our profits away. Okay, why did I say that's unique and entertaining? Well, have a look at what's happened here. It is a golden rule in microeconomics, and golden rules always have exceptions. A golden rule that firms will try and maximize profits and hence will set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. Well, it's slightly different here. This is the exception. It's not the firm that's done that. It's the entire oligopoly. We set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue for the entire oligopoly, and that dictated how much we produced and what we charged as a firm. So if you can manage to collude successfully, not start to cheat and compete away your profits, you can achieve an economic profit in that manner. However, if you cheat, so let me now, we've moved the animation on, get rid of this. If you cheat and start to compete against each other, you'll always end up in a perfectly competitive solution. So the important thing is to manage to collude and keep and stick to that agreement. If you start to compete, you'll wipe out all oligopoly profits. So that is what it would look like under perfect competition. Okay, another example of coming up to a Nash equilibrium, the prisoner's dilemma, as I mentioned earlier. This is probably the one you're most familiar with. As we've just demonstrated, firms can earn a greater profit in an oligopoly situation if they collude. They fix industry output, share the profits. Game theory suggests if you cannot detect cheating, you'll violate the agreement and increase output. Here is the classic example, the prisoner's dilemma. Don't spend too much time on this. The exam will focus on the bottom version, give you economic profits. But the classic that Nash invented is at the top, the prisoner's dilemma. Says you've got two prisoners, both convicted of the same crime, both being held in completely separate rooms at the police station. And here's the deal. If they both confess, they're going to get 2 years in prison each. If they both stay silent, they'll both get 6 months. But here's the rub. If one rats out the other, so if A confesses and B is silent, A walks free and B gets 10 years. Vice versa, if A is silent and B confesses, B gets to walk, some sort of plea bargain, and A gets 10 years. Clearly, it's fairly logical and rational to look at that and say, right, well, let's both stay silent, do our 6 months, and get out of here. However, it's pretty difficult to do that. What the Nash equilibrium says is you'll choose the best outcome, anticipating what your other party, the other party in the oligopoly, or here the other prisoner, is going to do. So you can look at this in lots of different ways. If I just look at prisoner A's decision, sat alone in the cell, wondering what's going to happen to the rest of their life, well, you're trying to wonder what prisoner B is going to do. And prisoner A would say, right, what if B is silent? If B is silent and I'm silent, I get 6 months. If B is silent and I confess, I go free. So if B is silent, my best option as prisoner A, if B is staying silent rather, is to confess and go free. What if he confesses or she confesses? Well, in that case, if B is confessing, I stay silent, I get 10 years. I confess as well, I get only 2. Well, confessing is still my best option. So whatever I assume B is going to do, my best option is to confess. Decision made. B is going to do exactly the same. We've decided A is probably going to confess. You could stop there and say B knows that. B knows that A knows that. So B says, right, A is confessing. If A confesses, obviously my best option is to confess. Or you could go through exactly the same logic and say, right, if I'm B, what if A stays silent? Well, for prisoner B, if A stays silent, 6 months versus going free, I'll go free. I'll confess. Or if I assume A confesses, well, B stays silent, gets 10, confesses, gets 2. Well, B confesses. Both decide to confess. There is your Nash equilibrium. If you want to switch that to an oligopoly example, well, instead of prison sentences, we put in economic profits. If you both manage to collude, honor the agreement, we both make an economic profit. However, if one firm cheats, that firm scoops all of the profit. Either A, and of course what will happen is we'll end up at the same Nash equilibrium where we both cheat and wipe out our economic profits. You're asked to explain, describe that in the exam. It's possible that you may see a couple of numbers just to put together and just talk about the level of profit that we'll make in each of those situations. So make sure you can look at that, understand how we come up with that Nash equilibrium. So putting some numbers onto that, we can see here just completely made up profits. If we both honor, we get $225 million of economic profits. If we both cheat, only 150. But again, if only one firm cheats, then they take a huge portion of the profits. So yet again, there's an incentive for both to cheat. So we can look at it like this. Let's say we're both starting off honoring the agreement. A is making 225. A has an incentive to cheat and make 300. B can see that. So it says, look, if A is going to cheat and make 300, there's no way I'm honoring the agreement. My best option is to also cheat and end up at 150. But A does the same. They both honor. B is going to cheat. That's what A thinks, because B could increase its profits to 300. So A thinks, I might as well cheat as well, and we end up with a Nash equilibrium. So it's in an oligopoly's interests to try and collude, but it's very difficult to do so. It will be successful with those points at the bottom of the slide, or more successful. So the fewer firms you've got to try and keep an eye on. Homogeneous products make it easier. Similar cost structures, because then we can come to agreements a lot easier. And obviously, certain and severe retaliation if people do actually cheat, and nobody outside who can come in and start to eat into your profits and eat into the agreement. They are your main oligopoly models to look at. And hence, yep, the Nash equilibrium. The final one is really not that exciting, so I'd focus on the others. A dominant firm simply says this: you may have an oligopoly where one dominant firm is the lowest cost producer and therefore produces most of the output. Essentially, that's the market. It decides from its own demand, its own marginal revenue, its own marginal cost curves, what it's going to produce and at what price. Other firms take that price as a given. So remember, perfect competition, you have everyone in there as price takers. In a dominant firm oligopoly, one firm sets the market price and the others pick up the scraps at that market price.